Good evening, everyone, and good morning, Professor Cochran-Smith. Welcome to the Academy for Leadership in Teacher Education International Webinar Series for Exemplary Scholarship and Knowledge Exchange. We are honored to have. I would like to introduce some house rules. First of all, in order to avoid unnecessary noise throughout the session, we have muted all of you and your cameras are turned off as the default setting. Any member of the public who is not yet registered may watch the lecture live from our faculty Facebook page and YouTube channel. The lecture will also be recorded for uploading onto different faculty online platforms after the lecture. In the Q&A session, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can help you ask the questions. The Q&A session is exclusive for participants who have registered for this webinar. The raise hand function will not be responded. For the rundown of today, Professor Cochran-Smith will deliver the lecture for around an hour. After that, there will be around 20 to 30 minutes for the Q&A session. Now, may I invite Professor ALiTE Goodwin, Dean of Faculty of Education, to give a welcome remarks. Professor Goodwin, please.
Thank you, Crystal. Good evening, everyone. Although for Professor Cochran-Smith, it is good morning and an early morning at that. So thank you so much for being with us today. I'm very, very happy to welcome my friend and colleague, Professor Marilyn Cochran-Smith, whom, as you have already heard, is the Cawthorne Professor of Teacher Education at this Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College in the US. Drawing on her research interests, which include practitioner inquiry and teacher education research, practice, and policy, with a focus on social justice and equity, Professor Cochran-Smith is a frequent presenter nationally and internationally. She has a huge international reputation and following in teacher education around the world. Marilyn has written 10 books, 7 of which have won national awards, and is the author of more than 200 articles, chapters, and editorials. Her co-authored book, Reclaiming Accountability in Teacher Education, just won the 2020 Best Book Award from the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. Professor Cochran-Smith was also a 2020 winner of the Spencer Foundation's prestigious Mentorship Award, as well as the 2018 winner of the American Educational Research Association, AERA, Division A's Lifetime Achievement Award for all the amazing work that she has done over her career in teacher education. Professor Cochran-Smith is an elected member of the National Academy of Education, a former president of AERA, an AERA fellow, and an elected member of the laureate chapter of the Kappa Delta Pi National Education Honorary Society. We are really thrilled and grateful to the Ting Ka Ping Foundation, who supports generously this lecture series, and very happy that Professor Cochran-Smith is our Ting Ka Ping Foundation speaker this year. I wanted to add a couple of things that are not in Professor Cochran-Smith's bio that I think are important and interesting for you to know. So first of all, Marilyn started her career as a primary school teacher. And actually studied literacy and languages and language arts early in her career. She was the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Teacher Education between 2000 and 2009. That is a long editorship that she was persuaded to sort of keep on with because under her leadership, the quality and prestige of the journal increased multifold. It is the premier teacher education journal with an acceptance rate of something like 9%, something like that, crazy, right? But so if you don't know the Journal of Teacher Education, it is certainly the publication for the profession. Marilyn has deep respect for teachers and teaching and has written game-changing pieces over her career that have reshaped the way we think about the work of teachers. And I'll just give you a couple of them. If you haven't read them, please look them up. One piece is called Learning to Teach Against the Grain in Harvard Educational Review. And in that piece, Marilyn talks about how teachers push against or can push against prevailing norms to reform teaching, to be sort of activists within the profession. And this piece alone has achieved over 1,000 citations. So as you can see, it is well cited and supports many, many pieces of work all over the world. Another piece is called Color Blindness and Basket Making Are Not the Answers. And this is in the American Educational Research Journal, where Marilyn talks about the dilemmas of race, culture, and language diversity in teacher education. Those are only two examples of pieces that literally sort of cause us to stop and think and change our direction in the field of teacher education. Her mentorship award from the Spencer Foundation is well deserved. She is a very generous colleague who has supported hundreds, if not thousands, of doctoral students and early career scholars, including myself when I was an early career scholar. And over her exemplary career, Marilyn has walked the talk and always herself thought, taught, and researched against the grain, always pushing the boundaries to help us see what we have not seen before. It is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight, Marilyn. Look really forward to your talk. And we're just so sorry that we had to cancel Marilyn's talk last year. And this year we have to do it on Zoom. So no nice dinners, no Stanley Market, no drinks on the balcony looking the ocean. So many things we're missing, but it just means that we'll do them again soon. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, or good morning. I'm really delighted to be with all of you virtually this evening, although I do very much regret not being there with you in person at the University of Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong for the first time for a conference on teacher education more than 15 years ago, and I had so much been looking forward to returning last March, as Lynn was just saying. As we all know, the global pandemic has ended almost all professional travel to conferences and seminars. Hopefully, it's opened up these new channels of virtual communication. So I am really, really pleased to be part of the Academy for Leadership in Teacher Education International Webinar Series for Exemplary Scholarship and Knowledge Exchange. And I think this might be the first one in that series. So I'm doubly honored. I want to thank Emily Chung, Senior Manager of Development and Communications for the Faculty of Education, for taking such good care of all of the details and arrangements for the webinar. And then, of course, I especially want to thank Lynn Goodwin, the Dean of the Faculty of Education, who, as you just heard, is also a colleague and a good friend of more than 20 now. Over the years, Lynn and I have had the opportunity to work together in a number of ways on what I think are really important issues in teacher education. So it's really a professional and a personal privilege to be part of this lecture series. I do regret, though, not being able to be there to meet with students and faculty at your university in person. And as Lynn just said, I am so very sorry to miss my planned trip to Stanley Market. Now I'm going to start sharing my screen at this point, and it'll take me just a couple of seconds to make some adjustments. So if you will bear with me. Okay, hopefully that is all set and you can, and I trust that somebody will let me know if you can't. As you can see, my lecture this evening has a very long title, Global Trends and Challenges in Education and the Place of Teacher Inquiry. As it suggests, to talk about what the two parts of the title have to do with each other. In other words, I want to ask, what do the trends and challenges characterizing initial teacher education in many places around the globe to do with teacher inquiry, and in a larger sense, teacher professionalism? The assumptions and ideas underlying the trends on one hand, and the assumptions and ideas underlying inquiry on the other correspond? Or do they conflict with? And if it's the latter, if they conflict, what are the implications? I'm going to tell you in advance that some of what I'm going to say may be a bit negative in what I hope is the best intellectual and professional of that word. I also want to say, by way of a qualifier, trying to do a lot by combining these two parts to one talk. I've been thinking about this, and I think that speakers often choose. They can say a lot about one thing, or they can say about a lot of things. And I've chosen the latter because I want to focus on the picture here. But this choice necessarily means that I can't talk about all the nuances of the individual bits. So I ask that you take that into as you listen. As we know, in developed countries, the 20th century shift from an industrial to a knowledge economy, unparalleled attention to the quality of education systems and to teachers. Many nations developed very high expectations and students, including teaching all students to world-class, serving as the linchpin in educational reforms of all kinds, helping to diminish social inequalities. To accomplish all of this, education a sharp focus of attention in many nations. In order to boost teacher quality, we had to improve teacher practice, in turn, improve student and school outcomes. From philosophy, I'm going to use the word turn loosely to describe teacher education in terms of some of the broad shifts in thinking or movements toward and away from institutions. These turns that I'm going to talk about cut across countries to a great extent, cut across cultures and policy systems, play outly in different places. So based on my experience, and in a number of other countries, as Lynn mentioned, I've had the great opportunity to places and meet with teacher educators in many different places. So based on all, I've identified 5 overlapping turns that I think a broad picture of teacher education today and the many challenges and trends that are ongoing, even though there are variations. And some of those vary on the fact that in some countries, education is highly centralized, while it's more decentralized, and sometimes in places like the US, even so 5 turns that I've identified and that I'm going to talk about for a while. The policy turn, the accountability turn, the practice, the university turn, and the equity turn. Now, my guess is some of these will deeply resonate with you, and you'll see direct connection to your own work related to teacher education. Other trends may be linked to the Hong Kong context, but you may see parallels to other countries' teacher education contexts that you're familiar with. So let's start with the policy. The policy turn is a turn toward trying to implement teacher quality or teacher education policies in order to desired outcomes, including the economic health of the nation. The assumption is that teacher education is a policy problem for policymakers, and that teachers are both the greatest problem and the best solution. So the point is for policymakers to try to figure out which of the broad structural arrangements and regulations that regulate as policymakers is most likely to have a positive impact on school outcomes. including students' achievement. Generally, policy structures and arrangements that policymakers try to manipulate or can manipulate do things like requiring teacher tests or performance assessments for education or licensure. Sometimes these have to do with changing the length of teacher preparation programs or establishing national or state standard teachers or education, or legislating which entry routes, pathways into are permitted. Now, let me give you a few examples to really get what I mean by the policy turn. So during the 1945 of the 50 US states established policies requiring teacher tests for initial teacher certification. Starting in 1998, and since then, the federal government started that every teacher education institution had to report to their state about the about the of their teacher candidates. And in turn, every state had to report to government. And in turn, the US Secretary of Education reported about how the nation was solving the teacher quality problem. Example, this one's from Israel. So in Israel, starting in 2000, a policy stipulated that every teacher candidate was required a year in an induction program at a school with a school mentor, to attend a year-long countrywide weekly workshop. And this was offered to universities and some other agencies. And then they had to be evaluated, principal and their mentor. And all of that happened prior to their being as a teacher. And then finally, here's a third example from Ireland. And I Ireland when this happened. So following what were described in the media as shocking and dramatic PISA test results in 2009, the Ministry of Education established a new policy that required all undergraduate level initial teacher education programs to shift from 3-year programs and required all postgraduate initial teacher education programs to move from 1 year to 2 years in duration. Here in Hong Kong, I understand, beginning in 2004 and 2005, of all service teacher education programs in Hong Kong were upgraded here undergraduate programs, leading to bachelor's degrees and requiring to 16 weeks of teaching practice. Now, as I understand it, there are 5 preparation double degree programs. So all of these things that are examples of the policy turn, where policymakers try to get in what they believe are the right policies to achieve their goals. I go through these 5 turns. I'm going to build this chart. Try in the middle column of the chart to note the underlying of these trends, so that in the second part of the talk, I can contrast assumptions with the assumptions underlying teacher inquiry and teacher profession. See why I'm saying I chose to try to do a lot and to try to present the big. So the assumption underlying the policy turn is the correct state or countrywide policies in place will yield better performing educational systems and produce a better workforce for the global knowledge economy. Policymakers simply need to figure out what the right policies are. Many teacher policies have a linear view of the relationship between policy, practice, and outcomes, and they don't put much emphasis at all on power issues or on social factors as the source of challenges to teacher quality. But this segues nicely into the second turn, which I call the standards and accountability term. Emergence of multiple teacher education accountability systems and schemes as the way to reform teacher education. Unprecedented attention to teacher quality in the 1990s in many places around the world was consistently coupled with new standards for teaching and teacher education, and increasingly with outcomes-based accountability, leading to what I have called the era of accountability. Many countries now have professional teaching standards, although there are also great differences in these, and they sometimes reflect conflicting ideas about teaching and the nature of professionalism. Now, again, I want to give you some examples. Clarify what I mean by this accountability term. The extreme may be the US, where over the last 20 years, what was referred to as space teacher evaluation was repeatedly deemed inferior to space ability. Now in the US, teacher education programs are held accountable for both inputs and outcomes. And one of those outcomes, depending on the state, includes the graduates of teaching, the graduates' performance in terms of raising student achievement, overall program effectiveness. The outcomes-based accountability in the US comes partly from state and federal regulators, but it also teacher education's own major national professional accrediting body, Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, or CAPE, and its forerunner, NCATE. And that group now makes some similar accountability demands. Now, here's another example from Australia. When I was in Australia in 2016, the federal government had just announced on Hattie to chair a group charged with providing leadership for improvement of teacher education. While I was there, I read one newspaper article this. Last week, Hattie indicated things were going to change under his watch. He talked of tougher and harder standards, outcomes, and impacts grounded in the requirements that reforms are working. 2 years later, when I again, I found that much of the work that Hattie had announced was indeed there was growing pressure to focus on outcomes. Many teacher educators about it. And there were new requirements in place requiring a state teacher performance assessment for all teacher candidates. So let's go here. With the accountability turn, the key assumption that external accountability is the driver of reform in teacher education. In particular, although teacher education is held accountable inputs in many places, such as the qualifications or dispositions, increasingly the emphasis is on outcomes, particularly performance of teacher candidates, and in some places, the achievement of eventual students of teacher education programs graduates. To the third turn, and I'm guessing you may have heard this phrase, because by now the phrase practice turn is fairly common parlance in teacher education to refer to the increasing emphasis that we should have clinically or practice-based experiences in teacher education, realizing that how newcomers come to learn to engage in teaching. The practice turn emerged internationally across professions, and it has a number of labels. You may have heard some of them. So it's sometimes referred to practicum turn, the practical turn, practice-based and clinically based teacher education. In many places, the practice turn was prompted by mounting claims that colleges and teacher preparation programs that didn't produce effect because of the long perceived gap between theory and practice, presuming that many of you have heard this term, the theory practice. The theory practice gap idea reflects the presumed weakness in some cases of the university model of teacher education, which supposedly emphasizes theory, values, and beliefs at the end of practice. So the criticism is that this kind of an emphasis teachers on their own to try to figure everything out. They're on their own to translate university-produced theory into classroom-ready practice. So the practice turn focuses on solving of enactment. The turn toward practice is strong in many countries, has many widely diverging manifestations. Again, in Hong Kong, 5-year double degree teacher preparation programs now require weeks of practica in classrooms across the 5 years. Time spent in the final year planned to increase even further within the next. One of the most influential examples of the practice turn body of research that some of you may know. This is research, especially if you're in mathematics education. This is research carried out by Deborah Ball and others. And these are people in practice as the core of professional teacher education. Ball and her colleagues have designated 19 of what they call high-level practices that comprise the core work of teaching. Their position, teacher candidates should learn these high leverage practices, which have been codified and verified by university researchers. And so these practices include things like leading about solutions to a math problem, probing students' answer response, and talking with parents. Interestingly, this work is translated and used in a number of places around the world, including in some developed like Chile, where they've translated high leverage practices. I think it's really important to acknowledge widely varying assumptions about what practice is and what the nature of practice as an assumption underlying turn. And I think many of you are probably aware of these differences. So continuing with, I have found that in many places, despite a lot of them, with the practice turn, the emphasis has tended on technical aspects of teaching that are decontextualized in particular classrooms and communities. I think as a continuum of practice from technical to complicated. And I'm going to return to this idea later, but for now, I've just a little diagram to the chart to signal that I think it's important to think about. And I invite you to think about your own view of practice in teacher education or learning. What is the focus of practice? What does practice in teacher education programs in Hong Kong? Is it technical or is it? The fourth turn is the university turn. The move toward strengthening the place of the university and of university in pre-service teacher education. This is often characterized by the effort to make teacher education more research-based. Now, here are some examples. I've observed this turn toward the university in countries, including Ireland, New Zealand, Scotland, the Netherlands, and Norway is an especially interesting example of the university turn. In Norway, they have something called the National Research School for Teacher Educators, as they call it. This is a consortium of 23 institutions that are PhDs in teacher education. The purpose of NAFL is bringing them all together with the goal of transforming teacher education from having a primary school-based and teaching-based foundation to having a research foundation. This is supposed to be accomplished by developing the research capacity of teacher educators who are creating a national knowledge base regarding teacher education in Norway. In addition, over just the last few years, Norway, with Portugal, Malta, Iceland, Romania, and Brunei, and there may be of others, started requiring that all pre-service teachers at all lower primary, so as low as kindergarten through secondary, had to earn a master's and do a thesis. The assumption is that this will improve the quality of teachers and teaching. Along similar lines, over the years or so, in a number of countries, and this would include New Zealand, the Netherlands, teacher colleges required to amalgamate with universities, and or there are more teachers now required to hold PhDs and engage in research. I'm hoping that we're still there. I can't see, so.
We are.
Okay, good. My whole shut down for a minute. Okay, so I'm still on the university term. US and to a certain extent England are outliers here, where because we have away from the university and away from the role of research in initial education. In the US, a growing number of teachers are being programs unaffiliated with colleges and universities. And this includes back to entries like Teach for America, which I'm guessing you've heard of for many years. People are also being prepared at new graduate schools of education. And these are places where teachers endorse them for teacher licensure and grant master's degrees. New organizations, not universities, not colleges, and they're not affiliated universities. Now that's the exception. The major assumption behind the turn toward the university and toward research is that teaching and teacher education should be guided by the theory and research produced by university researchers for implementing schools and classrooms. The idea is that teachers should be the users and the faithful implementers of knowledge and best practices by those outside of their schools, and that they should be prepared to apply those regardless of the context in which they work. My long-time co-author, Susan Lytle, and I, many years ago, referred to this assumption, relationship of knowledge and practice, as knowledge for practice, meaning knowledge generated by university researchers to be used in schools and classrooms. Finally, is the equity turn in teacher education, which that throughout the developed world, although some countries certainly have much wider disparities, there are serious discrepancies and gaps between historically disadvantaged groups. And this is in terms of educational opportunity, access, and outcomes. With the equity goals of many teacher initiatives, the assumption is that all students need to have equal to academic opportunities and outcomes. Now, my experience is that most contemporary teacher preparation programs, policies, innovations have as one of their stated goals, if not their goal, promoting educational access and equity by assuring students opportunities to have good teachers, good curriculum, good schools. Of course, no exception to this trend, as I understand it, with its emphasis on education for minorities and students from poor families. But underlying these equity initiatives are dramatically different ideas about equity means. And let me offer an example from the US. And I invite you to think about this in relation to the Hong Kong context. And Lynn, especially you probably already know about this. In 2016, new national associations of School of Education Deans, one called the Education Deans for Justice and Equity, and the other Deans for Impact. Both of these new organizations want to influence policy. Both of them want to make sure that all students have access to good teachers. They work from really different ideas about the purposes of education, the cures for inequality, and the role of education schools and deans. The Education Deans for Justice and Equity work from the assumption that we can't achieve educational or social equity without trying and then working to dismantle the structures and the of poverty and inequality that cause inequity in the first place. This Dean group is explicitly trying to change the narrative in the US, enhance teacher quality by enhancing teacher education. In contrast, the policy agenda of Deans for Impact, which represents the dominant approach, is to urge states to produce better data and programs about the impact of their graduates on students' achievement. Makes the assumption that is really the dominant assumption in accountability. And that is that the remedy for inequity is to distribute able teachers. So all students are prepared for the 21st century. And so everybody can help the nation compete in the global economy. My co-authors and I have referred to this view that I've put here on the chart as inequity, because the assumption is that if we increase the distribution of good teachers, we can get to equity, even if we don't address the social and economic structures and systems that caused the first place. The contrast is a concept of strong equity I'm going to come to later, so sort of hold on to that thought. So that takes 5 turns. And as I said at the outset, my goal here is turns a big picture about the trends and challenges in developed countries around the world in relation to teacher education and teacher quality. Of course, there are other trends, and more importantly, of course, there are exceptions. Lots of places where things are different. As I said earlier, although these are large overlapping trends, there are also some apparent contradictions, which you may have known, like the turn practice coupled with the turn toward the university. It's actually, I don't, when you look more closely, but I won't get into that now. That's a different talk. I think, though, that you in the audience know how these turns do not apply to Hong Kong teacher education, and you certainly know it far better. But my hope is that my analysis of these turns and their assumptions may suggest some new questions for your consideration. Now, as the title of my talk suggested, I now ask the assumptions underlying the turns in teacher education been talking about correspond to the assumptions underlying teacher and, in a sense, teacher professionalism. To do that, I'm going to use this slide as the anchor and as a point of comparison for inviting contrast between the assumptions underlying the trends, underlying inquiry, and teacher professionalism. So I'm going to come back to this again, and you see in the middle column the assumptions underlying the trend talked about. And then I'm going to insert into the right-hand column at exactly the assumptions that underlie teacher inquiries to really try to contrast. There's been a long tradition of teacher inquiry in around the world. I'm guessing that many of you are probably quite familiar with terms teacher research, action research, practitioner research, self-study, and some others. But I've found over the years that people often mean things, these labels. So I want to provide an overview of what I'm going to draw here on my work with Susan Lytle over many years. These are the two books, Teacher Inquiry, together. When we refer to inquiry, we talk a stance. We mean a dynamic and fluid of knowing, a way of being in the world of educational practice that time and settings. This idea of stance contrasts sharply with views of inquiry as a time-bounded, space-bounded classroom research project, or inquiry method, or inquiry as a set of steps for solving problems. Fundamental to our idea of inquiry as stance is the educational practice isn't just instrumental in the sense of trying to figure out how to get things done, but it's also social, political, a sense of deliberating about what to get done, get it done, and whose interests are served. So Susan Lytle and I realized inquiry as stance in terms of three foundational ideas. It's a theory of action grounded in the problems of practice, and practitioners theorize and act on those problems in the interest of students. Stance recognizes the collective intellectual capacity of practice as central to educational change. And inquiry stance, transformational view of educational change that blurs the boundary of leaders and followers. With these foundations, we've identified four of inquiry stance. In terms of knowledge, we reject knowledge, critical knowledge, dualism, and the usual knowledge hierarchies. Privilege academic knowledge over local knowledge of practice. In terms of practice, from our perspective, practice is not simply what do or say and when they do it, but also how they think and how they construct relationships with students and communities. So in theory are not two distinct things. Rather, practice is as inherently theoretical and interpretive, and theory stood to emerge from inquiry on practice. Inquiry community together to question their own assumptions, to pose problems of practice, study their own classrooms, and as well as, of course, studying the research of other people's. Communities alter expert novice models of proficiency, and they replace the pursuit of best practice with practice finely tuned to local histories, local cultures, and communities. Finally, teacher inquiry, as Susan Lytle and I have conceptualized it, is about equity and social justice ends, based on the assumption that the collective intellectual capacity of practitioners is a necessary condition for creating more equitable schools and society. Now, I'm thinking that it's probably already very apparent there are some important discrepancies in the assumptions underlying teacher education's major turns and the assumptions underlying teacher inquiry. But let me be explicit about it. As I said a few moments ago, the policy turn, this is in the middle top cell, assumes a narrow, rational view of teacher quality and assumes a linear relationship from policy to outcomes, sort of based on the facts. In contrast, from the perspective of teacher inquiry and teacher professionalism, teacher quality is recognized as in part a policy problem, but just as much, enhancing teacher quality is understood as a political. Now, here's what I mean. From the perspective of teacher inquiry, policy isn't seen as purely rational choice based on expediency. Rather, policy is seen as a struggle over ideas, competing goals, values, and public and private interests. Teachers and teacher educators who understand teaching as, in part, a political activity try to challenge practices that they don't think serve their students well, and they often reject neatly packaged or predetermined solutions to problems presented as if one size fits all. Teachers who understand that teaching is in part ask a lot of questions, not because they're failing, but because they pose problems, identify discrepancies between theories and practice, challenge common routines. Now, learning to teach like this, not to mention teach like this, is challenging and sometimes discouraging, but it certainly does not depend simply on getting the right policy. What about accountability? As I've said, in teacher education, underlying that is the assumption that external boost comes. In contrast, underlying the whole concept of inquiry is the assumption that teachers are already accountable. Being a teacher means being accountable. Many of the teachers I've worked with the years have their most basic commitment, a deep and passionate responsibility for their students' learning and life chances. I think the concept of intelligent professional responsibility is really helpful as a counterpoint to external accountability. And this idea has proven thought-provoking for teacher educators and others, especially their school-based colleagues that I used to work with in a number of places around the world, because this idea turned the notion that unless teacher education programs are monitored by external agents, and unless teachers are monitored by external agents, they're unlikely to perform appropriately or effectively. The notion of intelligent professional responsibility breaks three ideas: intelligent accountability itself, evaluation based on inclusion and dialogue, and a supportive relationship, external and internal accountability. I want to say just about a sentence about each of them. British philosopher Honora O'Neill is the person who originally suggested the intelligent accountability term. She said that the audit culture that had grown up in the public sector hadn't resulted in an improvement in people's work. Rather, it had resulted in a lack of motivation and in mistrust. She said what was intelligent accountability that begins with, and with the idea that the people who do the work in a particular actually know something about that work and want to be better at it. The second idea is about evaluation as inclusive, dialogic. The idea here is that everybody who has a legitimate interest in evaluation should be included in decisions that affect interest, and that there should be a kind of rough balance and equality of power in various parties. If you apply these ideas to teacher education and inequality of intelligent ability, this means that evaluation would be jointly determined dialogue and deliberation among teacher educators who are centrally involved in programs, including their school-based colleagues at local schools and people from the community. Excuse me. The third item has to do with the relationship between external and internal, and that external accountability should support internal accountability. Along these lines, Michael Fullen and his colleagues suggest external evaluators should concentrate on creating the conditions for professional responsibility inside schools, and we think inside programs. So this would emphasize capacity building and stakeholders collaborating within and across institutions. So the base of teacher inquiry is accountability, as I've shown in that right second column down. But this accountability is much in the notion of intelligent professional responsibility that I've just outlined, is to internal accountability. The result of intelligent professional responsibility into practice is heightened trust and enhanced professional. Go now to the practice turn. As you can see, with the practice suggested, that the dominant assumption is that practice is how, when, where teach things, with an emphasis on teachers learning technical and teaching moves that work. So here it's assumed that complicated can be composed into parts and decontextualized for training, and then recomposed in actual classrooms. Meanwhile, with teachers, the assumption is that although teaching has technical and complicated aspects, sure, teaching and learning are fundamentally complex processes, deeply embedded in the context of personal relationships, embedded in schools, and related to family and community life. Now, this is a very connection, but I have found over the years that a little book about writing by Annie Lamott, and it was called Bird by Bird, Some Instructions on Writing and Life, is relevant to thinking about the complexity of teaching. In one chapter, Lamott advises writers to avoid simple oppositions in plots and characters. I used to think that paired opposites were a given, that is the opposite of right, the opposite of wrong. But now, sometimes into these concepts because it's so much easier to elude than to suffer reality. Now, I don't think anything is love. Reality is unforgivingly complex. Now, I find that this aligns in a certain odd way with the key assumption about teaching and practice that underlies the notion of teacher inquiry. Teaching practice is unforgivingly complex, and practice is always about more than what a teacher does or says. I've also found it really interesting that complexity theories also make a distinction between complicated and complex things that I, again, have found helpful. Now, you notice up here in the corner of this slide, that same little diagram that I've had on the chart. Complexity theorists suggest, as you can see on the left side of this slide, that complicated things are highly sophisticated and have many parts, but the parts can be accurately and fully analyzed individually and apart from one another. And the relationships between the parts are highly stable and predictable. Examples of complicated systems include jumbo jets, iPads, rocket engines, each of which has many parts, is incredibly complicated, but each part can be given an exact description, can be taken apart and put back together. In contrast, with complex things, which are also sophisticated and composed of many parts. Complexity is manifested at the level of the thing itself. Complexity comes from the interactions and nonlinear relationships of the parts, and from intricate feedback loops in the systems. Relationships are not fully predictable. The whole is not the sum of the individual parts. Examples here include things like the brain, bacteria, and both ecological and social systems, none of which can be reduced to the sum of its parts. The concept of inquiry is the assumption that teaching practice is more an ecological system than a rocket engine. Now I'm university turn. As I said earlier, the prominent university turn represents a research, university-generated knowledge. As I noted a number of years ago, enlightenment of this relationship, knowledge for practice, that is, generated by university researchers for use within schools and classrooms. Inquiry, there is a very different underlying relationship about the knowledge of the knowledge practice. And this is more consistent with what we call of practice. From this perspective, basic questions of and teach what it means to generate knowledge, who generates it, does knowledge, and to whom, and how knowledge is used and evaluated in context are always open to question. The basis of this knowledge conception is that teachers across the professional lifespan play a critical role in generating knowledge of practice by making classrooms and school sites for inquiry, connecting their work in schools to larger issues, and being a critical perspective on the theory of research and research of others. I want to note here, the idea is not that practitioners' research provides the information we know in order to improve practice. And it's not that the knowledge generated by university-based researchers isn't of use to teachers. Of course it is. It's also not assumed here that practitioner researchers, teacher researchers, use the same strategies as university-based researchers, raise the same kinds of questions, and therefore they add to the knowledge base a new body of generalizations based on their perspectives inside schools. Rather, implicit in this idea is the assumption that through inquiry, teachers across the professional lifespan, so this means from very new teachers, teacher candidates, all the way through very experienced teachers, their own knowledge and practice, as well as the knowledge and practice of others, stand in a different relationship to knowledge. Let's get back to equity turn. Here in the middle column, I emphasize many reforms related to teacher education and teacher quality around equity as a goal. But as I suggested, a conception of equity is prominent. That is, it's broadly assumed that equal or the same access to good teachers, good curriculum will create equity without challenging and the systems and structures that produce inequity in the first place. Underlying the notion of teacher inquiry is what my colleagues and I called strong equity. And you remember that the dominant in the middle I referred to as thin equity. Strong equity, not complex and intersecting historical, economic, and social systems that create inequalities in access to education and resources in the first place. A strong equity perspective that equity can't be achieved by teachers, teacher education, and schools alone, because it requires educators with policymakers, families, communities, advocates, to challenge the structural and systemic aspects of schools and systems that lose inequity. Now, we've developed this idea of equity in conjunction with ideas about teacher inquiry. And we have come to talk about 4 core assumptions about what it will take to really get to equity. And we label these 4. First is redistribution. So what we're talking about here is that we need to redistribute to all schools teachers who know how to teach all students, not only the core skills of literacy and numeracy, but also how to engage in self-advocacy, how to deliberate, how to engage in critical thinking. Redistribution is a central idea of thin equity, but we are adding 3 more. The next one is, you can see, is recognition. This means recognition by teachers, school leaders, and curriculum makers that the values, knowledge, traditions, and linguistic and cultural resources of minoritized students, families, and communities are assets rather than deficits in school curricula, school practices, and local practices. Assets that teachers can build on rather than deficits that need to be overcome. The third aspect that we add, and this is related to the one I just talked about, is representation. We're not going to have strong equity until we have representation of the voices, perspectives, and goals of all who are involved and who are supposed to be served by the schools. And that the developed curriculum, practice, and local policies, not just that some have to sign on to goals and values established by other people. Finally, the 4th R we talk about is reframing. And by that, we mean we need to rethink and reframe powerful ideas to equity, equality, and justice that position people into dominant ideologies and really have an influence on what happens in schools. And by this I mean especially ideas like color blindness and democracy, which in many countries, including mine, mask and systemic nature of inequality within a discourse of individualism, access. So, where does it? Clearly, there are wide discrepancies between many of the assumptions underlying the trends that characterize teacher education in many parts of the world and the assumptions that underlie the practitioner inquiry movement. More than that, Dick Swamy wrote a seminal book called Reclaiming Research as an Agency for Change. In 2018, published with 8 of my former doctoral students, a book, Reclaim Accountability in Teacher Education. This reclaim is helpful, I think. Many definitions of the word reclaim focus on the idea of retrieving something back that was previously lost or denied, like reclaim right to the throne, or something that was temporarily separated, like reclaiming your luggage. Other definitions highlight the idea of a resource that was previously unusable into usable condition, cultivation, or treatment, like reclaiming or reclaiming water supply. But if you read further down in the definitions of reclaiming also include the idea of rescuing something from an undesirable state or reforming something or improper conduct. I think Dixie Goswami reclaiming the classroom because she wanted to emphasize that teachers, educators, are professionals and knowledge generators. They're not just or implementers of theory and knowledge generated by others outside the classroom, that teachers are problem posers, not just problems identified by experts outside schools and classrooms, have the potential to be advocates and activists for equity, accidental conveyors of the status quo. My co-authors and I idea of reclaiming accountability because we wanted to reject definitions of teacher quality that are connected only to boosting a nation's competitive global economy. We wanted instead to think about what accountability would look like if it served justice and equity goals, if it worked to eradicate the structures and systems that produce inequity in the first place. I hope that these ideas prompted interesting questions and ideas about the relationship between trends in education and teacher education, teacher inquiry, and profession. I'd be happy to hear from you now or at a later time, and on this slide, email address and my website. So please do feel free to contact. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Cochran-Smith, for the inspiring lecture. We noticed that there were some connection issues, and we are really sorry about that. We will try to upload a recorded version of the lecture with subtitles for your reference. And please also rest assured that we will upload the PowerPoint onto our faculty website for your reference later. Now it's time for the Q&A session. Please type your questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can read them out for you. The raise hand function will not be responded.
Where is the chat? Would be good if I unmuted. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for a really rich and thoughtful discussion. And I actually brought my copy of your book. So this is Marilyn's latest book with a great team of people, which is another indication of the support that she provides and the mentoring that she gives to many people. So I certainly recommend it. So, you know, I'm thinking, I'll start the questioning. And I'm just thinking about teacher educators in Hong Kong, in the Faculty of Education, many of whom are on this talk. There's a great move in Hong Kong to upgrade the teaching profession. And there's a great deal of focus on the continuing professional development of teachers. At the same time, there's a great deal of pressure on teachers to make sure that students are well prepared for the exams. And students are also very anxious because those exam results dictate, you know, the university that they get into. So how should teacher educators help the teachers they're preparing or the teachers that they're providing, that they're working with out in schools, to sort of think about the tension between, you know, their identities as professionals, but also their responsibilities to students and families who have certain expectations?
I think that in the first place, people who are teacher educators or providers of professional development, I think they have, or I would suggest that they recognize that tension. And the teacher candidates or the experienced teachers that they're working with, that we often don't explicitly identify that. We don't explicitly say, what does it mean if we focus only on test preparation? Whose interests are served? Whose interests are not served? What do we leave out when we focus only on test preparation? On the other hand, if we ignore test preparation, what are the disadvantages? And I think if we, as teacher educators or providers of professional development, put this on the table as a topic, as an issue that we need to think about together, I think that's the first step. And I don't often see that done. Teacher inquiry groups, sometimes called professional learning communities, learning groups, are really popular in many places around the world. But what they do inside those groups varies considerably. In some places I have seen, including some examples from the US, what happens inside those groups is very much like test preparation. It's about examining data that has the test results from previous years, perhaps looking at specific questions. Where did our students go wrong? What kinds of questions did they miss? And it becomes a community, if you want to use that word, but a group in which it's all about raising those test scores. But I think in other places, teacher inquiry groups have raised really important questions in their schools about equity. So for example, one teacher community that I worked with a number of years ago recognized that there weren't very many, and this is perhaps much more a US problem than a Hong Kong problem, but they recognized that there weren't very many girls going into advanced science and math courses in their middle school and their high school. And they did an inquiry about why that was happening. They interviewed students, they interviewed parents, they interviewed community members and teachers and the people giving advice. And they together looked at the data to try to come up with a plan to make things different in their classroom. Now that's, seems to me that kind of inquiry is about preparing people for the future. It is about being responsible for preparing students who have rigorous opportunities to learn advanced material in science and math and other areas. So I think that it's not just either we do test preparation or we do something that doesn't matter. It's like that gets relegated to, if we're not doing test preparation, we're really not fulfilling our responsibility. I think there are lots of ways to fulfill our responsibility. I never tell my students to ignore tests or to ignore ability that's with preparing people for tests. That doesn't do anybody any good. Take those tests. But I think putting on the table, what are we doing when we're doing that? And making that students as well. I've seen teachers with students who are a little middle school, secondary school, who look with their students at test and think of preparation. What can we do to address these issues? And is there a way that we can enrich students' learning in a way and prepare them for tests? So, but I think it's obviously whole talk that I've given has pointed at those discrepancies. So it's a perfect, and I think the first thing we have to do is recognize what those discrepancies are, and there are places where there can be common ground, and really together about missing and what we're gaining if we go one way or the other. I don't think it's a choice or the other.
Thank you. We have received quite a lot of questions.
Any questions? So I'm thinking that trying to sort of make a judgment about this. There's a question here about thinking about trends and asking you sort of to put on your crystal ball hat. How do you see these trends or these turns evolving in the next 20, 30 years or so? what do we need to do to move in the right direction? To what degree are these trends achieving the ultimate aim of preparing young adults to be caring and compassionate citizens?
Well, that's a really interesting way to put it, because I know that preparing young adults to be caring and compassionate citizens is part of the language, I think, that is often used in Hong Kong. As you know, it's not the language that's often used in the United States. I do think that one of the directions many places around the world are moving, and unfortunately not so much the US in my view, is that they're moving toward more, they're moving toward broader goals that are more humanistic, goals that really do have to do with preparing people who are well-rounded, who do care about other people. And so I think of them sort of as goals that are more UNESCO-like than OECD-like. I hope no one from OECD is here to say that. But so I do think that one trend is that in many places, governments, policymakers, school leaders perhaps, are seeing the limits of just having an economic perspective on teacher quality and on improvement, and instead are having a broader view that is more humanistic. It has economics. We live in a globalized economy. We have to pay attention to issues. I think that we're seeing a move in that direction in a lot of places in Europe, in some Asian countries, and I hope to go in. And I think that ultimately, if I'll take your words, caring and compassionate and intelligent, and I would add a lot of other words as well. I think ultimately we'll have people who do well on tests, because I think we can work with students, we can work with teacher candidates in ways that take broad questions and making up broad questions, reading and writing broadly. People learn skills of problem solving and deliberation, which I think we need at this point in our world, where we live in the polarized society. We live in a society in many countries. Groups of people have dramatically different viewpoints. They don't understand the viewpoints. There's no attempt to understand or exchange views. I think that I hope, this is more a hope than a prediction. I hope that we will begin moving in the direction of everybody to be able to live and work in a society that respects the viewpoints of others, teach students how to teach them how to understand of other people. It's a really powerful concept, I think, of perspective taking. That is a skill we ought to be trying to teach teacher candidates and students in schools, because I think we're at a point, if we don't do that, we're going to destroy. It's a terrible thing to say, but as I say, this is my hope. I'm not sure what direction really going to go in.
A question that these are all coming from our viewers, and this I think connects to this idea of hope and future. So the question is, about reclaiming, and I personally just love all the many definitions of reclaiming, but the viewer is interested in an example of how reclaiming can connect with teacher inquiry.
That your whole question broke up and I didn't.
Sorry. So the relationship between the notion of reclaiming and teacher inquiry?
Really, that's what Dixie Goswami's book was about. As I said, she wrote that book 30 years ago. But one of the things she was talking about was, and there was this is sort of a flip comment, not meant, but one of the things that was said in that book is that we don't need more research. Now, I think more on lots of things, but the provocative comment, need more research. We need more people to think about we have and what it means in the classroom. And that's part of what Dixie Goswami was reclaiming. The subtitle of her book is Teacher Research as an Agency. She was connecting teacher research and teacher inquiry to right from the beginning of her argument. Her argument was teachers need to reclaim their position as people know about teaching, as people who can draw on relationships with students and their everyday connect students to figure out how to create learning environment that support the that build on the assets, build on the linguistic resources that people bring to school. So she was inquiry and reclaiming right from the beginning. And it was really reclaiming their role as professionals, as people who learn teachers and then you learning to be teachers throughout the entire professional lifespan. Do that by continuously posing questions, asking others, pushing others, trying to get assumptions. I had that one comment I made in the inquiring teachers ask a lot of questions, not because they're learning. So the whole idea is that people who engage are always asking questions because of their deeply respect for the students in their classroom. And because they see teaching as an act of raising questions, not just an activity of engaging in practice or engaging in moves that they learn to do. So to me, inquiry and are intimately linked right from the beginning throughout the process. And in my experience, teachers who have worked in inquiry communities where there are important questions, and many of the inquiry groups raise questions. That is one of the things that Susan Lytle and I found in our big overview of inquiry around the world was in many, many places around the world. That's what inquiry groups on was equity and diversity and inequity, and trying to look at how there sometimes unintentionally fosters and produces and what they could do to change as an individual, as a school, larger one. So I think inquiry has everything to do with becoming part of being a professional rather than simply being somebody who puts in practice what somebody else tells them to do.
The next question connects well to the whole issue of equity. This faculty member is interested in your sort of observation about the impacts on teacher education brought about by the pandemic. And we know the pandemic has widened the equity gap, made it very, very visible, but there are also, sort of exacerbating conditions around xenophobia and nationalistic trends. How is teacher education thinking differently? How does it need to be different as a consequence of the mirror that COVID has put in front of us?
I think that's a good way to put it, that it has put her in front of us. I think as a field, COVID has brought into sharp relief some of our biggest failings as educators, but also more broadly in terms of the education system. At the same in the US and some other places, we've had racial protests about police brutality, system, institutionalized history of racism. So in the US, we can't think these two crises, they're very different from one another, but they've happened at the same way. And so I think many teaching programs in the US and elsewhere are now really saying, what are we really doing to raise certain kinds of questions? Are preparers who can work with students who are in emergency situations? Are we preparing teachers who realize the enormous inequities that exist in terms of security, many of the other basic conditions of that on many teacher education program websites, you do a random look almost since last March, many have made statements about the pandemic, about racial injustice. And many of them have said, equity, we are working hard for equity. A few of them have said, sure, we're really doing enough. We thought we were. Really not sure we're doing what we ought to be doing to address this. Has made us look more carefully and more closely at ourselves, that the ones who at the point where they're saying, we got to look again, we're not sure. I hope will continue. Hope it's not just a momentary change. I really do think this is an opportunity. We need to see this as an opportunity to rethink our goals in teacher education, to rethink our curriculum, think the ways we work with communities and schools, and to rethink this whole idea of systemic inequity. It's different in Hong Kong than it is in the US. It's different on the East Coast of the US, where lots of big cities like Boston, Washington, that's in the heartland of the US, where it's a rural area. There are differences. But I think this idea of inequity and disparity that the pandemic got so much into sharp relief is worldwide. Take this as an opportunity to look closely at our situations, and that we're willing to stick with it and see things that we don't want to see, that we don't like to see, that we wish weren't. And I see some progress in that direction. Lots of us have lots of initiatives going on. I hope that they get beneath the surface of these issues.
Sounds as though the next thing we need is sort of, in some ways, a huge international gathering where folks become sort of a large professional and global professional learning community, talking about these issues, sharing practices, solutions, problems, trying to connect to each other. I am well aware of the time and the fact that we have unfortunately run out of it. So first of all, it's really hard. You deserve to hear thunderous applause. So imagine thunderous applause, because we are grateful, we are happy, we are so thankful and pleased that you joined us this evening, evening for us, morning for you. There are many, many more questions that we're not able to get to. Is it all right for folks to write to you with their questions, since you invited them to? So that's terrific. So everyone, please take this opportunity to interact with Professor Cochran-Smith and engage in that inquiry with her. We do apologize for the technical issues. That's the one thing about all of this, that we can't always be sure that things will run smoothly. But as Crystal said, we will make sure that we have the sort of closed captioning for the video so that we can kind of fill in the blanks. So thank you. Hope you have a great day planned. Say hi to everybody. And we definitely have Stanley Market on tap. You have an open invitation for that the next time we see each other here in Hong Kong.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your patience. I don't know how you were seeing things. Did you get most of the talk? The talk was not broken up? Good.
There was some lag time, but the great thing is that you have wonderful slides that were full of good information. So we definitely got the information and got the ideas. So that was important. Great.
Thank you, everybody, and I'm going to go have breakfast.
Oh,
and
sounds like a great idea. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Really appreciate your presence. Look forward to, look out for the next announcement, because this is a lecture series. Marilyn's was our first. Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this is the National Webinar Series to be held on November 23rd by Professor Yong Zhao. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next lecture and our future events. Have a nice evening.
Bye, everybody.